Disturb her. Trip of a lifetime. Let's fucking go. Yeah, so Katt Williams just has infamous interview at Club Shay Shay and had some choice words to say about a few people. There has to be the gayest fucking podcast name in the history of the universe. Club Shay Shay. But my perspective on how Katt Williams came across in that interview was polar opposite from everybody else. I feel like I'm the only person that thought Katt Williams sounded cringeworthy. And something I will say is if you're a public figure and you want to air out your grievances with like another public figure, I think podcasts like that one are the perfect arena to do so because both sides can thoughtfully lay out their case to somebody neutral, separate from one another. They could lay it out to the same person or they could each pick their own person to speak to, and then they could let the public be the judge once they hear both people and both sides of what they have to say. And if you don't want or need the public to be the judge, then just keep it behind closed doors in the first place. But my problem with Katt Williams was just his overall tone. Like, he didn't just air out grievances. The large majority of what he was doing was just outright hating, like shaming Ricky Smiley for being illiterate. And you know none of these people have ever done anything that terrible to Katt Williams, because if they had done so, then you would have heard about it in the interview. Like, why is Katt Williams so fixated on the fact that Cedric the Entertainer can't write stand-up comedy? Like, who the fuck cares? Katt Williams is way too successful to be caught up in some irrelevant nonsense like that. And I hear the word narcissist thrown out a lot, and I just always figured it's another word for a compulsive liar. But the Katt Williams interview reshaped what I see a narcissist to be, because I didn't necessarily think he's like lying about anything, but that interview has to be textbook narcissism. It doesn't matter what the question was. Katt Williams always made the answer about himself, whether it's how great he is, something great that he's accomplished, or something great that he did for somebody else. I was literally laughing by the end of the interview, and he blatantly contradicted himself in a narcissistic way right around the midpoint. And like, when you're talking off the cusp, I don't hold somebody accountable for contradicting themselves or like talking in circles, because it's easy to misspeak and say something that you don't necessarily agree with. But when the contradiction brings it back to how great you are, then I don't feel bad picking apart what you're saying. It's a petty example, but I was like already not liking what he was putting down, and then this kind of like pushed me over the edge. Like, I could barely listen to this shit anymore. But it was like right around the midway point. Spotify broke the podcast up into two parts, and this was like right at the beginning of the second part. Shannon asked Katt how he approaches acting roles, and he goes, regardless of what the role is, I erase me from it. And then like 20 seconds later, in reference to the character that he's playing, he goes, I don't have a problem being a go-getter because I'm a go-getter, so I bring whatever I can to these characters. And then he paused for like mad long, because you could see he realized he totally contradicted the point that he was making. And then another contradiction that he made was earlier in the interview. He said that he doesn't fuck with strip clubs. If he goes to the strip club and he sees a girl that he likes, he's getting her out of the strip club. He said it on the podcast. He tells him, shorty, like, this could be your last day stripping, which is nonsense, because he's not about to wife up a stripper, and he isn't going to keep putting money in that girl's pocket for the rest of her life. If she quits because Katt Williams was like, you're with me now, like, how long is it till she's regretting quitting her job? I wouldn't exactly call relying on Katt Williams to hand you money for the rest of your life to be a viable financial plan. But that's besides the point. What he was saying was he doesn't do the whole strip club thing. And then later, when he was talking about doing shows in other cities, he was saying how he's not one of these performers that just does their show and then leaves town. He gets out there and immerses himself in the city. And I'm pretty sure he said he hands money out to the homeless, but I'm positive that on his rant he mentioned strip clubs as being one of the places that he goes to, if they're earlier saying that he doesn't fuck with strip clubs like that. It's a petty contradiction, but it just highlights the point that he was just talking in circles. And going along with his narcissism, Shannon asked him what up-and-coming comedians he likes, and he ends up rambling about how he's always the first one to give an opportunity to young comedians, and how he sends messengers to put money in young comedians' pockets just if he thinks that they're funny. But the part that pushed me over the edge with his narcissism was when Shannon asked him, you don't think Cedric's a good comedian? And Katt responded, the people don't. I have 12 specials, Cedric has 4. Whether or not Cedric the Entertainer is a good comedian has absolutely nothing to do with how many specials Katt Williams has. Everybody's life isn't a competition against Katt Williams. Just because Katt Williams has 12 specials and Cedric only has 4 doesn't mean Cedric's a bad comic. And there's not a direct correlation between how good of a comedian somebody is and how many specials they have. Somebody could have 20 specials and still be a hack, just like it's possible for a great comedian to only have 2 specials. How good you are is associated with how many specials you have, but there's not necessarily a direct correlation. I was going to say I bet Chappelle doesn't have 12 specials, but then I looked it up and he has exactly 12 specials also. So if it's a contest of who has the most specials, does that mean Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle right now are tied as comedians and whoever puts out the next special first is the better comedian? But then what if the other one puts out 5 specials in the next 2 years? Is that one now the better comedian? I don't think it's a direct science between how many specials you have and how good you are. And I don't think just because Katt Williams has tripled the amount of specials you have, it means you're a bad comedian. But I think it's more about quality of content opposed to quantity. The quantity game only exists because this shit's a business. If people just created for fun and nobody made money off of it, you think that everybody be fucking making 30,000 specials? You think Rogan would be following people that say, oh yeah, I do a special? Yeah, nah, they be fucking doing a special when they fucking want to do a special. And I don't know if you know this, but Katt Williams goes so hard working out that he once tore his rotator cuff doing push-ups. And don't quote me on this number, but he read something like 10 books a day when he was 7 years old. And he even went on to say he runs a 4.340. I think that's the speed NFL players run. It seems far-fetched that he could run a 4.340, but even if he can, like, what does his 40 time have to do with anything? Shannon's like, you don't think Cedric's a good comedian? Katt's like, I'll run a 4.340. One thing Katt Williams said that actually did resonate with me was when he was like, they said I'm on drugs. Like, what drugs am I on? I don't do no drugs. And I remember when that was a thing, like, people would say, oh yeah, Katt Williams went crazy. He strung out on drugs. Like, during my first Manic episode, anybody that I talked to was trying to tell me I was on drugs. And I was like, I'm not on drugs. Like, stop trying to tell me I'm on drugs. Like, when people can't make sense of somebody's behavior, if it's a certain type of person, they just assume they're on drugs. And like, when you're not on drugs and people try to tell you that you're on drugs, it just makes you mad. But the main reason I checked out the podcast in the first place was because I wanted to hear the comment that he made about Rogan in the context of the interview. Like I said, you can't necessarily hold somebody to what they say when they're speaking off the cusp, but I'd see things differently if Shannon Sharpe asked him, how come we've never seen you go on any of the major comedians' podcasts before? And Katt Williams responded to that, Joe don't want me on his podcast, but that's not how it went down. Katt Williams just threw Rogan's name out of nowhere for no reason. Obviously, like, I'm biased towards Joe Rogan, but I don't know why so many people perceive him in such a negative light. No one could point to anything wrong that Rogan's done to them, yet mad people are always throwing shade at him. So Shannon asked a question, and Katt responded all smug, and like most people probably know what he said. He was like, that's like me being on Joe Rogan. Joe don't want me on his podcast. I gotta be on Shannon. Joe has 6 comedians on that have never been funny that he won't push out. Like, I want to break what he said up into 2 parts, but I don't get the point that he's trying to make when he laughs. Like, Joe don't want me on his podcast. Maybe he's trying to say, like, Rogan doesn't want funny comics on his podcast because he sees them as, like, a threat. But Rogan's had Chappelle on, and I think everybody agrees that Chappelle is, like, undeniably funny. Now, right here, I was going to say, like, that I'm puzzled and have absolutely no clue as to what he means by that. But then I saw a video of Bert Kreischer talking about it. He threw in the word white boys. He said, oh, yeah, Joe got 6 white boys that have never been funny. And I saw Andrew Schultz separate from that also making it about race. And I had thought they sounded gross taking it there, but in their defense, it isn't as bad as I initially thought, because originally I hadn't picked up on Katt saying, I gotta come do Shannon. When he says, Joe don't want me on, I gotta come do Shannon, that undoubtedly sounds like it has a racial innuendo behind it, and that Katt Williams is saying, I gotta come do the black platform. So I think it makes sense for people to see it as Katt Williams was subliminally making it about race. And it's probably true to what Katt Williams is saying, that traditional black comics are reluctantly accepted into the mainstream. But that's why what Andrew Schultz was saying actually does hold merit, even though he sounded like so ridiculous when he was talking. But he said Katt transcends color, and he's definitely right. but it probably wasn't always that way for Katt Williams, and he probably had to climb mountains to get there. But so the overall point is, if his statement has racial innuendo and he's saying a black comic has to go to the black outlets, him saying that doesn't bother me like it would most white people, and I think that there's validity to if you're talking about mainstream outlets. But I just think Rogan's podcast is different, and if Rogan knows the comic personally, I think he'd get anybody on, and race is a non-issue. But for like Katt Williams right now, in terms of getting on Joe Rogan's podcast, race is totally a non-issue. And I bet when he says Joe don't want me on his podcast, he has absolutely no basis behind it, and it's absolutely wrong. Obviously, like now Rogan would get him on because like it would look bad if he refused to. He even said he would get him on. But even before this, there's really not the slightest doubt in my mind that if Katt Williams wanted to get on Rogan's podcast, all it would have taken was a phone call. A year ago, if a story surfaced of Rogan refusing to get Katt Williams on the podcast, I would have thought that there had to be more to the story than just that. And it's so ridiculous for Katt Williams to say what he did, because I feel like doing a podcast with Katt Williams is something Rogan would have been excited about. Not to mention, it's good for business. It would have been a highly anticipated episode. If he doesn't have a specific reason, why would Rogan not want to get a high-profile guest on, specifically when it's a well-respected comic? Like, if anything, now Rogan wouldn't want to do a podcast with Katt Williams. He obviously would do it just to be politically correct, but he's probably thinking like, you don't like me? Okay, fuck you then. I don't need to sit around and talk to you for 3 hours with an awkward layer of tension between us. The conversation would have terrible dynamics. And another reason I don't think Rogan would ever hesitate to get Katt Williams on the podcast is because I think Rogan feels a sense of obligation to the comedy community to share his platform. He said it before, how the podcast has really gotten bigger than him. It's almost like he's just the face of it, and like he feels like he has like responsibilities because of it. Unless he has a reason as to why he doesn't want to do a podcast with a specific comic, I'd guess he's literally never said no to any highly regarded comedian who's reached out to get on the podcast. And that's why I think Katt Williams sounds ridiculous saying what he said. There probably are comedians that Rogan wouldn't want to have on the podcast, but would feel obligated to get them on. But Katt Williams isn't one of them. He's a comedian that Rogan would feel obligated to get on the podcast, but would also want to have on. It's such a joke for Katt Williams to say that Joe doesn't want him on the podcast. It's not like Rogan has a limited number of episodes where he has to be over selective. He could do podcasts with the 6 comics that he wants to push out and Katt Williams. So that was the first part of what Katt Williams said, that Rogan doesn't want him on the podcast. And now for the second part of what he said, Joe got 6 comics that never been funny that he want to push out. I saw a video speculating like which 6 comics it is, and it's a well done video, but in the video the guy goes like it's not clear as to whether or not Katt Williams has 6 comics in mind. I don't know how anybody's takeaway from that interview could have been that he might have been calling out 6 comics specifically. For better or for worse, everything I say on this podcast is calculated. If I said that Joe has 6 comics friends that aren't funny, I'd probably have 6 specific comics that I'm referring to. But Katt Williams was just talking out of his ass. I would be shocked if he can't even name 6 of Rogan's comedian friends. I think it was apparent that he was just making a statement and 6 was like the random number that came to his head. I think he meant the comment, but like you can't take the number at face value. I take it more as him just saying the comics that Rogan's pushing out aren't funny. So the question is, are the Rogansphere comics not funny? I want to keep it real without disparaging the very people that I'm trying to connect with, but one of the driving forces inspiring me to start creating stand-up comedy was continually listening to comedians on Rogan's podcast and thinking to myself, like, I know I'm funnier than this person, and he's such an easy target. But I remember listening to that dude Jamie Kilstein talk, and it had me thinking, if this guy's a professional comedian, I know I could be a comic. And I just use the term Rogansphere comics because that's what I've recently heard them referred to as. And I think there's like 2 layers to that. Comics in his close orbit and then comics in his extended network. If we're talking about his extended network, whether it's a lesser known LA comic or like a well-established comedian, in my opinion, he's definitely had comics on that aren't funny. But Rogan's in a tough position with the podcast because he gets caught in the middle, because there's going to be some instances where he really can't say no, even if he doesn't necessarily think that the comic is that funny. Whether it's like a well-renowned comedian or one that he's just friends with, he can't be like, sorry, but you're not funny enough to get on my podcast, to somebody that he's like well acquainted with. If his reason for not getting somebody on the podcast was that they're not funny enough, if later that gets back to them, it's going to stir up drama. And when you're talking about like lesser known comics that Rogan's friends with, he knows that this could springboard their career, so he probably doesn't want to deprive them of the opportunity, and it's at no cost to him. There had to be a few lesser known comics from LA that Rogan got on the podcast that he doesn't necessarily think are all that funny, but he felt bad not getting them on because of a combination of how close he was to them, the work that he's seen them put in, and knowing what the platform could do for them. And it's not even technically a comedy podcast, so even if Rogan did feel obligated to get somebody on that's not all that funny, he could still do a podcast with that person without the quality of the content necessarily suffering. He could just pull up some videos of bears attacking tigers or some shit. And then once he shares the platform with the comedian, from there it's up to the public whether or not they support said comedian. Even if Rogan is pushing out comedians that aren't funny, it's the public who's making them successful. So I undoubtedly think that there are comedians in Rogan's extended network who have been on the podcast that you could say have never been funny, but any comedic population that you pull from, in my opinion, is going to have people thriving in the ecosystem who have never been funny. If Katt Williams ran a podcast and had over 100 comedians on, I bet you I'd find a lot of them to not be funny. There's well-renowned comics who, in my opinion, have never been funny. There's comics in the Rogansphere who, in my opinion, have never been funny. And then there's working comics coming up with no affiliation to Rogan who, in my opinion, have never been funny. But so I don't think Rogan's disproportionately pushing out comics that aren't funny, and humor is so subjective. It's so difficult to say decisively that somebody's not funny. And if I were to be critical of his guest, I'd say the not funny people are more so some of the people in comedy that he's connected to. And as for the comics, like the ones that he's closest with, those comics are the ones I'd say that he actually is trying to push out. Because like for some comedians in this extended network, I feel like he feels an obligation to platform them. But for the comics that he's closest with, these are the ones I actually would say that he's trying to quote unquote push out. And if I was going to jump to assumptions, I would say this is who Katt Williams was referring to, the people who he's had on repeatedly, the podcast. And I would say out of like the closest people to him, I kind of see it as like there's two different orbits. We have like the younger comics that he's co-signing, like Tim Dillon, Shane Gillis, Andrew Schultz, and Mark Norman, etc. And then you have his people's that he's been friends with since basically the origin of the podcast or before it, like Joey Diaz, Bert Kreischer, Tom Segura, Duncan, Brian Callen, Tony, Ari, Fitzsimmons, etc. Like basically, like you know the crew if you know Rogan. And in these two groupings, the younger comedians that he's co-signing and his closest people that he's had on since day one, these are the people that I'd say Rogan's really trying to push out. But I think the list is more like 20 to 25 comics opposed to like 6 specific ones. Like I said, like I think the number 6 is just an arbitrary number, and Katt Williams' point was more so like none of the people that you're pushing out are funny. Like I think that's the point opposed to the number 6, because you really can't limit it down to 6. Like if you tried to pick 6 closest people to him, I think you'd end up with 12. You know what I mean? Like if you tried to pick the 6 closest people, I think it'd be tough to really limit it down. But I'd say there's 20 to 25 that he's really push forward. And I think the large majority of them are funny, but I have a higher bar than Rogan does on what a professional comedian should be. To Rogan, the bar is set at, are you funny or not? My bar is set at, are you funny enough to be a person that I would drag myself out of the house at night and pay money to go watch you be funny? To me, the bar is set higher than are you funny or not? So for me, it's not about whether or not they're funny. It's about whether or not they're so fucking funny that it should equate to being millionaires. So out of the 20 to 25 comics that like he's pushed, I wouldn't say most of them have never been funny, but only a handful of them meet the bar of a professional comedian to me. They're basically all funny enough to be worthy of doing sets on a stand-up show lineup, but when we're talking about packing theaters, sometimes arenas, like the bar is crazy high. But with that said, like full disclosure, in the 20 to 25 comics that Rogan's pushing out, there are a few names that stand out to me that I personally don't find funny. But what I do respect about all of them is basically none of them are hack. and I think that being hack is the worst thing that you could be in comedy. Whether you find them funny or not, all of the Rogansphere comics for the most part have original styles. In response to Katt Williams' interview, I've seen Bert Kreischer catching the most heat and getting called hack, and I disagree. Even if you don't think he's funny, like, Bert Kreischer to me is not hack. Like, what he does is unique to him. Like, it's his own style, it's his own cadence. And what's funny is, if I had to honestly say who the hackiest one out of Rogan's comedy friends is, I'd honestly say it's Tony. I think he's hilarious, and he is in a handful of Rogan's friends who is a professional comedian to me, but I see him as more of like a professional comedy club comedian because of how he approaches stand-up. I feel like his whole thing is the interactive show. He's a vintage example of somebody who's always starting wars with the audience. You constantly hear it on Kill Tony. Like, God forbid somebody has to get up and go to the bathroom during the show. Oh, somebody's about to go jerk off. He's the king of berating the audience. When a comic tries to clown on an audience member and they're totally reaching for it and it's not funny, it legit like makes me mad. When the comedian does that corny ass shit to me, it basically turns me into a heckler. But people eat that type of shit up. Like, people love that shit. If you ask somebody in the audience their name and what they do for work, if you could make a cheap joke about their job, the audience is cracking up and in tears. But like, I feel like Tony embraces all the aspects of stand-up comedy that I hate. In terms of like stand-up, I like creating, but I hate standing on stage and begging for approval. If you don't think I'm funny, then okay, fuck you. And I hate being around annoying drunk people. Like, I don't even want to make them laugh. What I hated the most about doing stand-up is what I feel like Tony is a professional at, which is more so entertaining a crowd and managing a room of drunk people. And I bet like Tony's always mad present on stage. He's the perfect comic to deal with hecklers. That's when Tony, I bet, is in his prime form, when somebody's heckling. Like, I've seen videos of him picking apart hecklers on YouTube, and it's hilarious. But I don't even like that because I don't like when the comics feed into the audience members. Like, if you give them the attention, then they win because they got what they wanted, which was the attention. If it was up to me, like, if you interrupt the show, you get thrown the fuck out. Like, the other people here paid money to watch the comedian and you're just interrupting the show. I think it's so fucking rude. But Tony's a perfect example of why I hate stand-up. Like, I don't really like Tony that much as a comic, but I think he's hilarious, and Kill Tony is just like the perfect outlet for his humor. Him picking apart bucket pools and calling them out on their bullshit is like some of my favorite comedic content of all time. When someone's full of shit on stage, just nobody I would rather watch deal with that person, Tony Hinchcliffe. And he would make for a great lawyer. But the overall point is, at a time where there has to be exponentially more hack comedy than ever before, in the defense of the Rogansphere comics, generally speaking, I don't think they're hack, and to me that's refreshing. And this is going to feel great to say, even though I acknowledge his comedic greatness, and I think he is what a professional comedian is, Katt Williams has literally never made me laugh. And not only that, but I just saw a clip of one of his recent specials in my YouTube feed, so I watched it. It's a bit clowning on Biden for always being sleepy, and no pun intended, but it's a tired premise. It's hack to do at this point. But even more than that, when I was watching it, all I could notice was how fucking hack Katt Williams' cadence was. He does that comedy special cadence where like you're trying to be funny, but you're mad hyped and you overpronunciate the words. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then I realized what it is. It's an imitation Chris Rock. To me, Katt Williams doing his Joe Biden bit looks like he's jacking Chris Rock's style. That bit looks like he watched Chris Rock and then he went out and did stand up and imitated what he saw. It's not a testament against Katt Williams as a comedian. He's technically way better at comedy than I'll ever be at anything in my life, but that bit looked hacked to me, and his humor literally doesn't make me laugh. I remember when Katt Williams' DVD was like the biggest thing ever. That's kind of like when Katt Williams first popped onto my radar. I bought the DVD, and like my takeaway from it was like, it's not my cup of tea. I usually feel bad saying that somebody doesn't make me laugh or that I think that somebody's stand-up looks hack, but it feels great to air out about Katt Williams because he's just shitting on everybody. It feels like everybody else is just fawning over him because they think he's the funniest person ever. So like, it kind of feels good to be like, okay, I don't even think you're funny. You know what I mean? Like, I acknowledge that you're funny, but you don't make me laugh. But what he has that most Rogansphere comedians don't have is he has it. He has the it factor that you hear about. He's got that like eccentric comedic charisma. It's something you can't teach. It's like some people are just the funniest person in the room before they even speak. And then when they turn on their humor, like everybody just takes a back seat to them. Chris Farley was like the epitome of this. Katt Williams and Chris Farley are like both absolute characters. the comedic alphas. But just like Katt Williams, Chris Farley like didn't make me laugh either. But I'm just trying to paint the picture of what a professional comedian looks like to me. Like the Rogansphere comic that totally has it, in my opinion, obviously is Joey Diaz. But just like Katt Williams and Chris Farley, Joey Diaz literally doesn't make me laugh, but he looks the part to me. I think he embodies the essence of what a comedian is. He doesn't even have to be trying to be funny. You could just listen to him talk and you just know that that's a comedian. It's the comedians with like the low energy comedic charisma that make me laugh. The comedians that I find like their mannerisms funny. They come off absent-minded like Chevy Chase, Norm Macdonald, Kevin Nealon, and like most importantly like Dave Chappelle. I see it in Mark Norman too, and Brian Callen to a degree. And Will Ferrell doesn't necessarily make me laugh, but I think he has the perfect balance of the low energy and the high energy comedic charisma. But to be a cream of the crop comedian, to me, generally speaking, there is a comedic charisma that you gotta have, and something that comes natural. As much as Rogan says it's all about hitting up mics, I think that you could hit up a trillion mics, and if you don't have it, you just don't have it. All the comedians that I just listed that I like, and including like Katt Williams, Chris Farley, and Joey Diaz, are all funny without even trying to be. And to me, that's the essence of a true comedian that's worth paying money to go watch be funny. And I think sketch is a better outlet for their humor than stand-up. I think improv is corny, but inspired sketch comedy is like the best outlet for humor in my opinion. But so my overall take on whether or not Rogan's pushing out comics that have never been funny is, for the most part, it's not true. But anybody, and me included, could probably pick a few Rogansphere comics that they personally think have never been funny. And for a lot of the Rogansphere comics, there's an imbalance between how funny they are and how successful they are as comedians. And that's because of the podcast. But nobody forces anybody to support any of these comedians. So if the general consensus is that the Rogansphere comedians are more successful than they should be, then generally speaking, people have nobody to blame but themselves. And is it a bad thing that if because of Joe Rogan, a lot of comics are more successful than they would have been otherwise? No one loses when Rogan platforms comedians, other than the ones who are getting left behind. And this is the biggest problem I have with Katt Williams critiquing the comedians that Rogan's pushing out. He knocks Rogan for putting on the people around him, and then later he went on to criticize Tyler Perry for not doing the exact same thing. It's so fucking hypocritical. Whether you like or dislike the people that Rogan's pushing out, he's undeniably doing the right thing. His only agenda is to help out the people around him. No matter how you feel about the people he's given the opportunity to, he should still be applauded. One thing that Rogan will never regret will be sharing the opportunity that he has with the people around him and improving their lives. He'll never look back at like, I shouldn't have done it for such and such because I don't think they were funny enough. And Rogan undoubtedly believes in all these comics. It's not like he's trying to deceive the audience when he builds up a comedian. And then Katt Williams went on to complain about gatekeepers while Rogan picked the lock and is leaving it open for as many people as possible. And Katt Williams was way more popular than Rogan 20 years ago. He could have built something like Rogan did, but since then I bet Katt Williams has sat around talking shit about other people while Rogan did what he did and essentially turned himself into a gatekeeper, and it happened 100% organically. It basically just fell in his lap by accident. Even if he envisioned the podcast becoming successful, he couldn't have ever imagined what it would become, where people could potentially build careers off of it. And maybe I'm wrong, but from my vantage point, Rogan basically has similar powers as the record labels did in the 90s, how he could surface an artist. And being on his podcast legitimizes you like signing a record contract used to. And it's all about getting that first wave of promotion. And Rogan has the exact audience centralized and isolated. It's not widespread promotion like the record labels had in the 90s, but it's more targeted. I think JRE promotion combined with the emergence of social media could possibly even build something more sustainable with longevity than the major label record promotion in the 90s because of how centralized the target audience is and how you could isolate your fan base through social media. But the major difference is the record labels made you sign a contract, and in return for them sharing their resources with you, they owned you as an artist until you fulfill your contractual obligations, whereas Rogan shares his opportunity and sets you free to be an independent artist without scraping anything off the top. Being in the Rogansphere is like free affiliation to a record label while still getting to own yourself as an artist. And there's probably never been anybody close to Rogan in terms of like the power that they hold that have been willing to share their resources without asking for anything in return. Literally all the gatekeepers are all looking to feed off of the careers that they build. No one ever does it out of the kindness of their heart. People are always complaining about the greediness of gatekeepers. Finally, somebody came along asking for nothing in return, and he still gets criticized because people disapprove of who he's putting on, when it's primarily his fucking friends. You literally can't win when you're being viewed under a microscopic lens. And creating this umbrella underneath him only made him stronger. Like, look what it got him, $1 trillion Spotify contract. But this is why Rogan's laying a blueprint of what it looks like to not sell out. First and foremost, a sellout sells out the people around him. And Rogan's doing the opposite. There's plenty of layers of selling out, but the most important one is not turning your back on the people around you. And sometimes it's not necessarily that the person's a sellout, it's more of the nature of their situation. I bet every rapper who signed a major record deal in the 1990s has at least 20 people who could call them a sellout because they all signed these shitty record contracts. There was like an illusion of fortune, but they were still like trying to fend for themselves. They didn't have an opportunity to put on anybody around them. If anything, the game created a crab in the bucket mentality, and rappers saw it as there was only so many spots available. Rogan's more so in the position of the actual labels itself than the position of the rappers in the 90s. And like I said, he's doing things the right way, so it's ironic to see a video of Mark Maron trying to call him a sellout. Apparently Mark Maron is the biggest fucking hater in the history of the universe. That guy has like serious issues. It's one thing to think the way he does, but to openly say it is fucking crazy. Like, you almost gotta respect the audacity. He has no shame. I saw a video combining a bunch of clips of him hating on Rogan and calling him a sellout to Rogan's face directly and talking about him on other podcasts to other people. It makes me want to see Mark Maron do stand-up because, like, after hearing him talk, I know none of his humor is gonna hit with me. And like I said earlier, when somebody's trying to be funny, if I don't laugh, like, I feel bad. But I wouldn't feel that way with Mark Maron after seeing that video of him trashing Rogan. I legit want to like go to a Mark Maron stand-up comedy show so I can just fucking laugh at his face at how not funny I think he is. But Mark Maron's hung up on the idea that Rogan's a sellout, and it dates back to at least the days of Fear Factor. The conversation I listened to like a clip of is so ridiculous. Mark Maron's trying to get Rogan to admit that he's a sellout for doing Fear Factor. And he's talking to Rogan like Rogan just doesn't want to admit it. But you could tell that Rogan's sitting there like, dude, this shit didn't even weigh on my conscience. And I'm paraphrasing the interaction, but Mark Maron says something like, at least just admit you think it's a pointless distraction and you don't condone that type of television. And Rogan's like, I have no problem with people eating weird shit for money, and I personally would never watch it. But if people want to watch it, that's on them. I don't fucking care. And this is where, to me, people misconstrue what selling out is. The world revolves around money. Like, what the fuck was Rogan supposed to do? Turn down a great job and risk going homeless to keep his integrity, even though the job didn't even compromise his integrity in the first place? Is Joe Rogan, like, only allowed to make money through stand-up comedy? And if not, does he have to, like, check in with Mark Maron to make sure he approves every time he accepts a job offer? It's like, don't hate the fucking player, hate the game. If hosting Fear Factor for money is selling out, then anyone who works a job that they don't necessarily want to be doing is selling out. They're compromising themselves for money. Even disregarding what the pay is, I'd rather host Fear Factor than serve tables. I think it'd be a more bearable job. So if I would rather host Fear Factor than serve tables, but hosting Fear Factor is selling out and I served tables for 10 years and did strictly for the money, then that means I'm a sellout by working at the Cheesecake Factory. And Mark Maron said to Rogan, but that wasn't you hosting Fear Factor. And then those people come to your comedy shows and expect a totally different person they were getting. Like, if somebody watches Fear Factor and they buy tickets to Joe Rogan's comedy show expecting to see a comedian telling jokes about eating bugs, then I don't know what the fuck to tell that person. And it's different if you're talking about like Bob Saget and Danny Tanner, because like that's playing a role that isn't him. I bet Bob Saget used to offend people all the time when they would come out to his comedy shows thinking they were seeing Danny Tanner and they would get Bob Saget. I didn't watch Fear Factor, but I bet Rogan was exactly who the fuck he is, except just within the parameters of that show and being on cable television. Didn't he like get in a fight with somebody who was like full of shit? Like, that sounds exactly like Joe Rogan to me. And what's ironic is I recently did think this fucking sellout motherfucker about Joe Rogan, and I know he'll agree with me on it. The most sellout shit that he does is doing ad reads for products or services that he doesn't believe in. I can't listen to him do one more stupid fucking read for Better Health where he says, does the new year have you feeling stressed out? If so, I got just the thing for you. Better Health's licensed professionals can help you out with the therapy you need to get your mental health in check in the new year. I'm guessing he has no choice but to read what's in front of him, but if he has any control over it, he shouldn't advertise for Better Health. Him advertising for Better Health is the epitome of the problem with modern advertising, in my opinion. It's good for brand awareness, but if you want to do effective advertising, then companies should be advertising through people who believe in the product or service. It's so stupid to listen to Rogan talk about how mental health starts with diet and exercise and then cut to him reading a promo for therapy. I don't know how it works. I'm assuming because of his Spotify contract, he doesn't get his ad read money, but if he's double dipping, then I'm guessing he has a choice as to which ads he does. And he doesn't need the money. He shouldn't do ad reads for better health if there's an option to not do it. And honestly, he's probably better off making slightly less money but not contradicting his message. It's just a bad look when you're listening to somebody trying to be informative and then they advertise information against what they preach. It makes you question the authenticity of their words. As a listener, me personally, I just separate the ads from the content. I've heard Rogan say in his ad a million times that he takes AG1 daily, but I've never heard him say it on the podcast. So until I hear different, I don't believe he uses AG1 daily, whereas I expect him to actually believe in and use Onnit products on the regular. But in my opinion, advertising for a product or a service that you disagree with is selling out, but I would do it too, even though I personally wouldn't advertise for better health. Like I said before, the world revolves around money. Unless you're in a really good position, you're going to have to sell out one way or another. I'd rather advertise for a product that I don't believe in than work at the Cheesecake Factory or drive people around all day or drop fast food on people's doorsteps. And then finally, like unrelated to that, but building on the point of selling out, plus it draws back to the Katt Williams interview, he accused Kevin Hart of selling his soul and like being an industry plan. And he went as far to say that Kevin Hart leaves the building if Katt Williams is going to be there because he can't face him and look him eye to eye. Only Kevin Hart knows if that's actually true, but that's a pretty bold statement. But a narcissist always makes everything about themselves. So if Katt Williams sees Kevin Hart leaving the building, he probably just assumes that it's because he entered the building when Kevin Hart actually just like had a meeting slotted before them and was on his way out. But not knowing nothing about anything, if I had to guess, I'd say it's not that Kevin Hart's an industry plant per se, but it seems like the gatekeepers of the main entrance opened it up for him. And when that's the case, these people essentially own you. And from there forward, they basically control your career. Not only are you indebted to them, but if you want to maintain your lifestyle, you got to play along going forward, especially in an industry like the movie industry where it's so reliant on getting hired for roles. Basically, you become their puppet. And I'm guessing that's what Katt Williams was saying about Kevin Hart. So if indeed that like is the position that Kevin Hart's in, it is a form of selling out, but I'd rather sell out like that for millions of dollars than work some bullshit ass job for some corporation making pennies. You need me to wear a dress in a movie, but I'm getting paid $5 million. Okay, just let me know if you need me to put makeup on also. And then finally, I want to close on some hating ass shit that Mark Maron said, drawing back to the Rogansphere. That guy's just the worst of the worst. Like, he can't be happy. It's a losing way to live life. He should call it better health, yo. Talk to one of their licensed professionals, get the help he needs. I can't believe people actually pay money to go watch him be funny. And this clip was posted from a YouTube channel that's very critical of Rogan, but in this video it painted Rogan in a positive light and made Mark Maron look terrible. But the clip was from Tom Segura's podcast, and Mark Maron said something like, "What I respect about you is that you weren't one of those people who rented space in Joe's attic." I'm not going to act like I'm tough and I get bold with physically aggressive people, but if I was Tom, I might have cut the podcast. Like, you know what? Get the fuck up out of here, dude. Don't come to my fucking podcast with your hating ass agenda. You're hating on one of my best friends who's not only never done anything bad to me, but opened up all the doors that I walked through. If anyone, quote unquote, rented out space in Joe's attic, Tom's got to be on the list. Your mama's house is basically on Joe Rogan's property. So if I'm Tom, I'm looking at him like, dude, do you got something you want to fucking say to me? It's like he went on Tom's podcast and threw an underhanded subliminal jab directly at him. And nobody's trying to rent space in Rogan's attic more than me. I've been filling out leasing applications for over 10 years now trying to get a spot up there. I don't know why it's seen as like an insult to someone to say that they came up through the Rogansphere. And in my opinion, nobody in Rogan's circle should be ashamed if the truth of their career is that they got to where they are because they're affiliated with Rogan. Life is fickle. Somebody putting you on could be the difference between being successful and never having a career. And Katt Williams was talking about gatekeepers because it's a real thing. For the most part, someone's got to open up the door for you. It's rare for somebody to become successful without another person sharing an opportunity with them. And this rarely happens as organically as people think it does. And And that's why the Rogansphere effect truly is a beautiful thing. It at least shows younger comedians a path and a pipeline to it. If you're a comedian looking to surface, that has to be the best outlet. If you're a young comedian, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to be a part of the Rogansphere unless it's out of like stubbornness, thinking like I could do this shit on my own. But if I was capitalizing in the Rogansphere, I could live with the fact that I owe the trajectory of my success to associate myself with Joe Rogan. I'm not going to lose any sleep over that shit. And I saw a video of somebody talking about like Rogansphere comics trying to break out of the Rogan orbit, and I just don't get why they would want it. It's like free affiliation to a machine. It's major promotion to lean on without having your career held hostage. And that's all I got. One last thing is I'd say if you're headed late to work and your boss asks why, just tell him it's because Katt Williams has 12 comedy specials. Start home, trip of a lifetime. Let's fucking go.